Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate that many of you are still enjoying this wonderful presentation that our chef provides for you. But in order that we can keep the show rolling and you can continue eating peacefully, I'd like to introduce our speaker. As I indicated to you earlier, we have Dr. Gerard Vaughan here today, and we're indeed very honoured to have Dr. Gerard Vaughan with us. Dr. Gerard Vaughan AO is the professorial fellow in the School of Culture and Communications in the Faculty of Arts, University of Melbourne. We know him best from his role of 13 years running the Australia's oldest public art gallery, our very own National Gallery Victoria. His achievements at the National Gallery Victoria are many, as you can well appreciate, and I'll describe a few of them just by way of illustration. During his tenure, the value of bequests, gifts and donations reached more than $300 million. That's quite a nice number in 13 years. He has brought a series of blockbuster exhibitions to Melbourne that many of us will have seen at various times, such as the Impressionists, the Picasso, the Guggenheim collection. He's seen a decade of development, the gallery, including construction of the Ian Potter Centre as Australia's first public museum dedicated to Australian art. That's at the Federation Square, and the redevelopment of the National Gallery Victoria International on Security Road. So I guess it makes him a bit of an engineer, so that's probably why we're getting on so well together at the table. He also led the gallery's 150th anniversary, which took place in May in 2011. Prior to joining the National Gallery Victoria, Dr. Vaughan was director of the British Museum Development Trust for 5 years. He's a graduate of Melbourne University and subsequently undertook doctoral studies at Oxford. And during his time at Oxford, he was a special assistant to the Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University for, I think, 3 or 4 years. And in that role, he was particularly involved in fundraising for Oxford University, which I guess is where he developed his expertise for fundraising for our own National Gallery Victoria. He has a lifelong interest in the history of taste and art collecting, both private and institutional, and is currently preparing a history of private art collecting in Australia, which will be published by Melbourne University Press in the near future. He has entitled his presentation today as The Future of the Art Museum. So please provide Gerard with a very good welcome.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And David, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. Yes, I often thought that when I sort of got out of art history, I could go into construction management, I have to say. And maybe I will one day, you never know. Also, thinking of the speech coming up, the presentation you're having next, tax-efficient death. Directors of museums know a lot about that too. I was thinking I could actually change my subject and talk about that too. But certainly fundraising is a very important aspect of what any director of any art museum does anywhere in the world today. And as I'm talking about the future of art museums, certainly the shift of balance between the sort of public and private is very interesting. And before I get into really what I do want to talk about today, the big issues around where museology is going, it is worth reflecting on how, even here in Australia, our society has changed very rapidly, very profoundly in the last decade or so. When I arrived at the NGV in 1999, trying to get my head around the finances, I looked at the gross revenues, all the money that came in a given year, and then of course I looked at the annual grant from the government of Victoria for operating and other expenses, and that was about 85% of the total, the government grant. When I left last year, it was about 48%. Now that doesn't mean the government's giving us less, it just means that the private sector is giving more. And I think that whole shift is profoundly interesting and and really does in all sorts of interesting ways influence where museums of art are going. But that's not really what I want to talk about today. What is the future of art museums? Well, I think I feel confident in saying it's a very bright future, both here and overseas. If you think back over the last 20, 25 years, perhaps even 30 years, you'll have noticed, not just in this country, but around the world, a rather phenomenal process of development, of redevelopment, of new museums being built, of the great old museums of the world, having redevelopment programs, new wings, new facilities, representing themselves as different kinds of institutions, and new activities that go with that. And the two things are linked, in fact, new buildings and new activities. You don't bother unless you are rethinking the way a museum of art is actually serving the many communities and the many groups of stakeholders that it's there to look after. It's often said that today art museums are really one of the factors against which cities are judged. They're a little bit like the cathedrals of the Middle Ages, you know, the great cathedrals of the Middle Ages, places of pilgrimage. And you would go to the great cathedral cities if you were a Christian in medieval Europe, for example. And in a funny way, although you might say, well, that's an absurd comparison, in a funny way, there's a certain amount of truth to it. And it's this, that I think now, if you look around at the growth in cultural tourism, the idea that people travel around the world and go from one place to another, in particular, they go to experience culture of many kinds. And art museums are there, obviously, to present visual culture. You might go for the opera, you might go for the music, you might go for any number of things. But I do think that museums of art are very much now one of those sort of factors that anyone takes into account when you're planning to visit somewhere. So it's not, in fact, such a bizarre idea of saying that art museums today are a little bit like the cathedrals of the past. Think of your own dinner party conversation. You know, when someone comes back from Europe, they talk about the exhibitions they went to, the museums they visited. Oh, we went to Bilbao to see the Guggenheim. Or what do you think? This was perhaps 10 or 15 years ago. When you're in Paris, did you go and see the pyramid at the Louvre? Have you been to see the new Museum of Modern Art in New York? Whatever it might be. I think this is not just, you know, the kind of people I know, because this is my world, but I think all of you have experienced that, and it's very important and very interesting. And of course, the rise of the Blockbuster exhibition is a very major part of this phenomenon and is a key driver in thinking about you know, what the modern museum is all about. It's interesting because when I arrived at the NGV, in fact, I thought when I was interviewed for the job, I'd better read the National Gallery of Victoria Act of 1967. And I quoted from it a couple of times in the interview, and they said to me afterwards, "You're the only candidate who'd read the Act, you know." But what I found very interesting, of course, was that the Act of 1967 made no mention at all of the role of exhibitions, because 1967 was before the advent of the modern blockbuster. And on numerous occasions I sent polite little notes through to the office of the Minister for the Arts in Victoria saying, I think we need a few revisions to the National Gallery of Victoria Act 1967, and one of them should certainly be about the expectation that government has, and it's very clear in all of the NGV's communications of government, that putting on an ambitious and interesting exhibitions program that will actually earn money and give an alternative stream of income to back up the grants made by government is so crucial that it needs to be actually enshrined in the Act of Parliament that says what the NGV is there to do and what it's all about. Of course, nobody ever came back to me, and I don't think the bureaucrats in the Minister's office were remotely interested in a revision to the Act to simply take account of the thing that most people want to do when they visit a museum of art, and that is make sure that they don't miss the great exhibitions. And many of you perhaps already have seen the publicity for the big Monet exhibition coming up. And that is perhaps going to be, for many of you, your one, maybe your only connection with the NGV in the course of this year. You may go to every exhibition. You may go on a weekly or daily basis, I don't know. I hope you do, but I suspect that in particular you'll go there, of course, to see the major exhibitions. So the advent of the Blockbuster exhibition has become very much a fundamental part of the life of any art museum today. And one of the reasons for it, of course, is that it gives variety and it drives numbers up. And bureaucrats, again, who advise government on levels of funding and grants, look at numbers of visitors, and that's very important. And it's one of the things I want to talk about, because I think it's significant, but also an inhibiting factor. The obsession that we have today, not just in this country, but around the world, with constantly increasing the number of visitors to art museums. And in that process, we may well be forfeiting something rather important, and I'll come on to that. But as I said, driving incoming cultural tourism is crucially important. We have a thing in Victoria called the Major Events Company, and they do everything. They do all the big sporting events, of course, the Grand Prix, you name it. And the Melbourne Winter Masterpieces concept, and Monet is the next, it'll be the 10th, in fact, in that process. That was invented really to help to drive cultural tourism into Melbourne in the winter period when tourism numbers generally were down. And it is very much a part of government thinking that the extra investment in that program will bring a kind of dividend in the money that tourists bring into the city of Melbourne, into the state of Victoria, and what they spend. So, more and more is being expected, I think, of the traditional museum of art. And never, as I suggested in my opening remarks, have art museums ridden higher, never more than now in the consciousness of their own communities and in the rest of the world. And one of the things that struck me coming back to be director of the NGV in 1999, and I was aware of it when I was a kid growing up here in Melbourne, but I'd rather forgotten about it, having lived overseas for such a long time, was the genuine affection that the community has for a great institution like the NGV, and not just the NGV, the State Library, the Museum of Victoria, but there was real affection. And I had to be reminded of that, and it's very much, and it's a very important part of the persona of the NGV and the way the NGV interacts with the community that it's there to serve. But as I've suggested, in all of this, there are some inherent dangers. And if we drive the quest for numbers, in other words, for bigger and more and better exhibitions, somehow at the end of that process, and I believe it's happening already overseas in some very major museums, we manage in that process, or we risk managing, we risk squandering one of the most important reasons of all for having art museums. What are they really there for? It's about learning, it's about education, but it's also about something very personal. It's about that aesthetic response to a work of art and the sheer pleasure and joy that anyone can get in confronting a great work of art. And thank heaven we all have different tastes. And certain works of art work for one person and not for another. But overall, that amazing sense you have when you confront a great masterpiece, and a great masterpiece need not be by a famous artist, it just needs to have those qualities that somehow speak to you and that give you a wonderful sense of being able to understand what the artist is trying to say. So, what is any museum for, and what is an art museum in particular there to do? Well, when I was invited to talk to you this afternoon, I had also just agreed, and by the way, Graduate House got in very quickly. Kay was terrific, and got in touch with me and said, come and have a talk to us, because I had just taken on responsibility for a graduate program here at Melbourne University on the history and philosophy of museums. It's normally taught by Dr. Christopher Marshall, who was off on sabbatical, so I was asked if I'd step in and take it over. And I'm loving it, I have to say. I'm debating every week with very bright graduate students the whole issue of museums and museology. And in the very first week, with the various classes I was taking, I just quickly went around the room. I could almost do it here today with this group, but I won't. And say, okay, what do you think art museums are here for? What are they here to do? And how do you use them? And what do you get out of them? And what does your family get out of them? And your friends and the next door neighbours? Why do we bother to have these institutions? Why does the government pay all this money every year to have a National Gallery of Victoria? Why does the British government have a National Gallery in London or at Tate? And why in America does the government not pay for anything? And why do interested citizens have to create a private institution like the Metropolitan Museum in New York or the Museum of Modern Art and back it and raise money for it and make donations and make bequests to make it happen and go on through the years and through the generations? So I asked them that very simple question. And I said, and by the way, there are so many of you, you can only have 2 or 3 sentences each. But it was good. It was a very, very interesting exercise to go through. And I got some very interesting and stimulating responses. The other thing about students today, because I haven't been teaching in a classroom situation for a very long time, I seem to remember when I was a student, both an undergraduate and a postgraduate, we were very respectful towards our professors. No way today. They love disagreeing with me and coming back and challenging everything I say, and I'm having a ball. It's really, really interesting talking about the history and philosophy of museums. But of course we began the program talking about the origin of museums, the idea of collecting and who collected, and at what point did these collections become available to the general public. In other words, when were private collections opened up to people beyond the owners and their families and their close circle of friends? So we talked about the origin of the modern museum. And of course, it really lies in the Age of Enlightenment, in the middle of the 18th century, with the creation perhaps of the first universal museum in the world open to the public, where I used to work, the British Museum in London, 1753. It was there for everybody. Well, not quite everybody. I think if you're an impoverished person who smelt and wore rags, you would not be given entrance to the British Museum. But generally, it was open to anybody who wanted to go. You did not have to be a person who was a friend of a great prince or a monarch, or at least be of such social standing that you could make a representation and receive an invitation to go and see a royal or aristocratic collection. Excuse me. The same applied, of course, in Rome, a little bit earlier. The papal museums of Rome were pretty much open to anybody because Rome was a city that brought in pilgrims from all over the place, and many of them were often very poor. So again, the great papal museums, mainly of Greek and Roman sculptures, were open to any comers. And I also worked in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford for a long time, and the Ashmolean claims it is the oldest public museum in the world. It's not really true, but it sort of is true. In other words, in the 1680s, the university had acquired various interesting collections, gifts to various people, and a man called Elias Ashmole decided to set up a museum room, not just for the university itself, for the professors, for the fellows of the colleges and their students, but for anyone who was of an inquiring mind. They could come and have access to that collection. So it's a very interesting history. I won't go into it. But so far as art museums are concerned, and by that I mean museums of two-dimensional art above all else, paintings, the Napoleon show that we did at the NGV last year was very interesting in that respect, because the Napoleon show showed the history of the Louvre, the fact that in conquering the whole of Europe, and being a very brutal man as he went forward, but driven by the ideas of the revolution, driven by the ideas of equality, which he put to one side conveniently later on, that he would have a great universal museum of art, and that he could justify looting all the greatest masterpieces from the countries that the French armies occupied, because they were going back to Paris to a public museum which was, in the spirit of the Republic, in the spirit of things being open to all, and they were being removed from the despots who owned them, from the kings, from the princes, and of course from the church, because they would argue, and Napoleon certainly in his early period would argue, that great works of art in monasteries, for example, were really not, people couldn't benefit from seeing them. So it's a most interesting thing. In the post-Napoleonic period, and this is what's really interesting, and this is what has driven the idea of the modern museum, for the first time ever, nations as nations, rather than individuals as princes, realized when Napoleon stole everything, and they had to ask for it back after 1815, they developed a concept of a kind of national cultural patrimony, that there are great works of art that define ourselves as a nation. And it was in the post-Napoleonic period that all over Europe, national galleries of art began to pop up. for that very reason, that having lost so much, not in Britain of course, but in the other countries that were occupied by the French, they realised how important it was to get those things back and to show them to the public. And then of course you have all these great educational ideas of the 19th century. In London in 1851, the Great Exhibition, which was all about learning and training, about bringing the greatest products from around the world and the greatest works of art together into one place to inspire artists and architects and craftsmen and general artisans. And as a result of that, of course, we have the invention in London of the South Kensington Museum, which was renamed later the Victoria and Albert Museum. And if you're looking for anything at all in the world that inspired the founding of the National Gallery of Victoria here in Melbourne in 1851, it was the Great Exhibition of a decade earlier, of 1851, and the invention of a museum to carry on that great work, to inspire artists, to inspire artisans, to have things that in the community that could be used as a kind of basis for further development. So museums of art in the 19th century were often linked to academies of art. The two were inseparable. You had an academy to train artists, and you would begin to collect paintings and have galleries beside them, and that of course is the exact history of the NGV. So the pattern that emerged in the mid to late 19th century, I would suggest to you, really continued until the post-war period of the 20th century. And then suddenly, and many of you will remember this, in the 1970s and the 1980s, the whole world of art museums began to change. These museums, which had become rather tired and rather complacent, just doing the same thing year after year after year, suddenly woke up and realized that they wanted to do things very differently. And a whole lot of things happened. We find all over the world museums of art announcing redevelopments, new buildings, new wings, and we have the rise of the art museum. Now this is a wonderful word, it's become one of my favourite words actually, since I've been teaching this course. The word starchitect. In other words, you have an architect who becomes an international superstar, and you can think of who some of them are. Frank Gehry, for example, who designed the Guggenheim in Bilbao, and he's done museums all over the world now. In Britain, there's another American artist, or North American one, Rick Mather, who's done a whole group of new museums, and on it goes. And certain architects, Jean Nouvel, for example, the great French contemporary architect, did the new Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and also the new Musée du Quai Branly, which is for indigenous art of all peoples and all nations, which was only fairly recently opened. So we have the rise of the starchitect, and then museums themselves becoming these draw cards for cultural tourism, and very, very important. But what each of these redeveloped museums did, and remember I mentioned in 1967, the NGV Act, no reference to exhibitions at all. We did exhibitions, of course. They were small, they were occasional. When I left the NGV, we were doing about 20 exhibitions a year, 3 or 4 of which were on a huge scale, and certainly 2 of them at least, on a kind of blockbuster scale. So the world of the NGV had certainly changed very, very significantly. But all of these new redeveloped museums of art had huge temporary exhibition spaces, because the age of the travelling exhibition was had well and truly arrived. And these museums and these exhibition spaces, to begin with, there were a handful of them, and then there were dozens of them, and then there were sort of tens and tens of them, and then there were hundreds of them. They were all spectacularly empty. And every one of them had directors and curators who had to search the world to have an unending supply of exhibitions which would fill them, and which would satisfy the demands and the interests of the communities that those art museums were there to serve. And of course, the greatest of them all was the Grand Louvre project in Paris. That cost billions of, well, in our dollars, it would be the equivalent of billions of dollars, and it went on for more than a decade, if you remember, beginning in the early 70s with the Chinese-born American architect I.M. Pei. And of course, something very, very simple, like the glass pyramid above the new underground foyer, became a kind of icon of our age. Everyone talked about the glass pyramid of the Louvre in Paris, in the same way that everyone talked about the superstructure of the Sydney Opera House. Very little to do with what was underneath, but it was the superstructure, the image, the engineering of the structure that caught the imagination of the world. Now, before the redevelopment of the Grand Louvre, the Louvre was not the most visited museum in the world. The British Museum in London had more visitors per annum, it was just under 2 million a year. And then, as bits of it opened over a period of time, as you'll remember. It went up to 3 million a year, and then 4 million a year, and then the complete project was finished, and more crowds poured into Paris to see the Grand Louvre project. The same art was there. It was improved. There were better installations for it, better lighting, better labelling, and whatever, but it was essentially the same art. And I.M. Pei, as I said, this world-famous architect, did the project. And last year, the Louvre, the figures have just come out. It was the most visited museum or gallery in the entire world. It had 8.5 million visitors. Now, is that something to celebrate? This is my fundamental question to you. Is it something to celebrate? Because what's the actual result? What's the outcome of having 8.5 million people pouring through the galleries of the Louvre? Now, I go to Paris regularly, both for work and pleasure. I don't really go to the Louvre anymore. It is such an unpleasant place to be. I cannot bear being pushed and shoved. If you go in the summer or the late summer, it's a Renaissance palace. They don't have good systems for moving air around. They can't pump cool air. They can't control the air through those hundreds and hundreds of rooms of a Renaissance and Baroque palace. The air is fetid, it's hot. It's a very unpleasant place to be. And most of the people, if you watch, and I watch visitors to museums, it's what I do, and most of them aren't interested in being there at all. They just want to be in the Louvre. And they want to see only one painting. And what is it? The Mona Lisa. And what's the French word for Mona Lisa? La Joconde. Yeah, Gioconda or Joconde in French. Exactly right. And the only sign you see throughout, the only consistent sign throughout the Louvre, there are no exit signs. You can't get out once you're in. You get lost. It's like sort of you wander around aimlessly. But is La Joconde, and that's what everyone goes to see. And those crowds rush past many of the greatest works of art in the world. And they don't look at them, they don't look to left or right. They just want to tell their friends they have seen La Joconde. Because the problem is you can't see it, as you know. It's in a room behind thick bulletproof glass. It's filthy dirty, it's deep brown, you can't see any details. And the French refuse to clean it, although it looks as if they're slightly relenting now. I told the director of the Louvre once that I had my own views on why they won't clean it. I said, because the Mona Lisa doesn't exist. It's probably just a poster covered with brown paint. I was being foolish, of course, but we were having a good lunch at the time. What I'm really saying is this, that I think that the whole idea of that great national French institution, one of the greatest collections in the world, one of the most extraordinary places that you could ever go, has been lost. And the French themselves are waking up to this. There is now a debate, a discourse in French society saying, why is it that we have lost the Louvre? Why is it that we, the French, can no longer enjoy our own culture? We can no longer go to our museum and see it and enjoy it because of 75% of the 8.5 million people who pour through those doors, clogging everything up. And I'm not saying that from an arrogant perspective, it is a practical thing, are actually disenfranchising the French, who find it very difficult to get in and to spend time in quiet circumstances and in a pleasant way to engage with their own cultural patrimony. It's a very, very serious issue. It is overcrowded, it is chaotic, and most people who visit the Louvre have a fairly miserable time. If you're going, don't go during the day, go at night, because at night the tourists are footsore, they're all home in their hotels, sort of having baths and whatever, and 2 nights a week is open quite late, and that's when you go, and that's when you'll see some French, by the way, in the Musée du Louvre. Remember, Paris has 12 million people plus, and it has 30 million incoming tourists a year. And cultural tourism, of course, is crucially important to the French economy. But somehow, in my view, and the French are asking the same question and debating it right now, what can be done to change things? Now, of course, the situation here is very different. And I think that's why I have a very positive attitude towards the future of art museums in this country. Blockbusters themselves are fading out in the rest of the world. There is a view now amongst many directors that too many things have been loaned too often, and quite frankly, if governments are investing in museums because they attract cultural tourism, it's better to keep things at home and say, well, if you want to come to Paris or to Berlin or wherever it might be, to the Prado, to Madrid, visit Madrid. You know, get on an aeroplane and stay in a hotel and eat out in restaurants and make a more general contribution to the economy of the country. And I found, as director of the NGV in the last 4 or 5 years of my time there, that this kind of attitude was becoming more and more prevalent. But there was always a response for Australia, and most of the time the directors would listen. It's all very well for someone else in another European country. They can get in their own car, they can do a quick hop on Ryanair, costs about $50, they can get a train, whatever it might be. They can come from Paris to Vienna or from Vienna to Berlin, whatever it might be. Even, you can even cross the Atlantic very quickly or relatively quickly and relatively cheaply, but that is not open to Australians. And that is why when we, for our 150th anniversary in 2011, when we did the big Vienna show, we were loaned works that the Viennese almost never lend, and in fact the Frieda Ritzler portrait by Klimt, when they gave it its temporary export license, the Austrian government that is, to come to Australia, they said this is the last time this painting will ever travel, ever leave Austria, in fact. But they were prepared to do it for us for 2 reasons. They accepted that Australians are a long way away, and it is very difficult to get to Vienna. But they also accepted, of course, that as a result of the history of Vienna and Austria in the 1930s and 40s, before, during and after the Second World War, that Melbourne had a very large diaspora of Viennese people, or people who came out of Vienna or whose parents or grandparents came out of Vienna. And the Viennese authorities said, yes, we need to respond to this and make some positive gesture. But what I'm saying to you is that it is very difficult, increasingly difficult, to do these big blockbusters. And if you actually begin to analyse some of the shows that are being presented in Europe at the moment, they are smaller than a traditional blockbuster of 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. But the blockbuster on the big scale, and the Monet show, that's about to open in Melbourne in about a month, is an example of a big scale blockbuster, and it will have a longer life here. The other difference, and I'm going to conclude with these remarks, is that, and I think it's very important when you think about the future of the art museum in this country, that we do not have the tourist numbers that the great cities of the Northern Hemisphere have, whether they're in Europe or in North America. The result of that is that the NGV, and this applies pretty much across the country, I would say that the numbers must be pretty much the same in Sydney at the Art Gallery of New South Wales or in Adelaide, about 75% of all those who come to the NGV, and it has on average 1.6 million visitors a year, making it always 24th, 25th or 26th in the world, which is a very good number. But about 25% of everyone who walks through the front door, by definition, is from Melbourne or from near Melbourne, from sort of close regional Victoria. The rest come from interstate, and only about 5 or 6% come from overseas. Compare that with the 75% who come from overseas to the big Paris museums. The director of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam told me once that 90% of their visitors are overseas tourists. I used to work at the British Museum. It used to average between 60 and 65%. Of all those people who walk through the front door of this fantastic institution, all paid for free, by the British taxpayer, weren't actually British and weren't British taxpayers. It doesn't matter. I'm not making a comment about tax law. I'm simply saying that the community itself is really handing, that such is the inflow of tourism that you have to ask yourself some quite fundamental questions. How do British people, for example, get more out of the British Museum? And it's just, as I said, there is no simple solution to this debate. The internet, new technologies are helping, in fact. There's no question about that. What, as I said, interests me most of all is just watching people watch art. And I walk around museums. In fact, I've been stopped by security guards. They're worried about me because I'm looking at security cameras, thinking, what security system have they got in, and whatever, and watching people and how they move around the space and how they interact. So, I would conclude by saying this. It is not a numbers game. Of course, we have to be popular. I'm not talking about doing esoteric things that would not be of general interest. If the taxpayers of Victoria, if I can bring it back to Melbourne, are going to invest more than $40 million a year in an institution called the National Gallery of Victoria or the Museum of Victoria, whatever it might be, then the government wants to know that that institution and those people running it, its management and its trustees, have an understanding of what the community can get out of it. So it is not about that entirely. And I worry from time to time about if, and the press don't help here, that if the press keep comparing every exhibition in the country with every other exhibition and saying, but you got 10,000 less for this or 15,000 fewer, therefore it's a failure, it leads to dumbing down, because it leads to bureaucrats and government and politicians and boards of directors and occasionally, dare I suggest it, directors and curators saying, let us go out of our way to do something immensely popular that is guaranteed to bring in massive numbers of people, but will not necessarily be as challenging intellectually as a different kind of show. And one example that we had in Melbourne over the last 4 or 5 years, and it's an interesting one, is that we did a series of 3 major exhibitions about German art of the 19th and 20th century, 3 big shows. Now, we did a lot of market research. We knew that we would, by definition, get much smaller numbers to those exhibitions because this art was so much less known. People had never heard of the great German expressionist artists. They didn't know the Dada movement in Berlin after the First World War into the early 20s. And yet we judged that it was very important for this unknown art to be seen in a very strong and powerful way with 3 very serious exhibitions. And so we did them knowing the numbers would go down. And of course, knowing that the press would make comments about, you know, why is the number for this exhibition lower than for others, and off they went. It was all very predictable. But of course, being pragmatic, sensible people, having to deal with politicians and bureaucrats, we knew that it had to be followed by 3 immensely popular shows, and hence the trilogy of exhibitions on Impressionism. We had Neo-Impressionism, called Radiance, Monet and his gardens about to open. Any director in the world knows, if you want to have a success, if you have to sort of, you know, convince government that you can get crowds and queues around the block, you have to do either Impressionism or Post-Impressionism, preferably Monet or Van Gogh, or Picasso. And that's about it. Anything else is much more of a risk, I have to say. But it was for us taking a 5 or 6 or 7 year view and balancing the tougher, more difficult exhibitions with those that will naturally be extremely popular, and saying to the board and to government, let us sort of effectively amortize it over that period. Because we actually want to do some tough, difficult, challenging shows. We don't want everything to be too easy and too popular, because that is a matter of concern. Well, I think that's all I want to say, really. So coming back to my first question, what are art museums for? Well, they are, of course, for scholarly purposes. They're for people to learn from. And when you buy works of art, when you do exhibitions, when you hang the collections, I always think about school groups coming through with a teacher, a university group. Will what we have put on display, will the rhythm of the collections be useful and meaningful for people wanting to learn at any level? And that, of course, includes self-learning, lifelong learning. But the scholarly didactic aspect is crucially important. There's also that element of aesthetic enjoyment, because museums should be enjoyable places to be. I like having music in galleries, for example, background music sometimes, to help you enjoy the works of art that you're looking at. And finally, we have to accept that in the society we live in, visiting a museum is a leisure activity, and there are many other alternative leisure activities, and that the NGV or the museum or whatever it might be, the National Gallery of Australia in Canberra, do have to compete also for time and the leisure dollar, and there's no question about that. And somehow, in working out what you want to do, how to make the museum relevant and interesting and a challenging place to be, you've got to balance all of those. I think that museums today and into the future are going to be more relaxed places. They'll be less restrictive. I think people will be encouraged and are being encouraged, and new technologies are helping that every day. There are new ways of allowing people to have access to different levels of information and engagement by using a whole range of new technologies, particularly social media. But all of this, at the end of the day, a museum is 2 things. It's a link with the past, and museums collect things from the past, but it's also got to be about the present and the future, how we are now, and how we live now, and how we can interpret it. So Richard Florida, the American theorist, has written very, very persuasively and interestingly on the creative city. In other words, looking through history and right up to now, the wealthiest cities, the ones that attract the wealth generators, the people with ideas, with energy, with verve, are those cities that invest in culture, because such people want to have cultural activities to engage in. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, you know, the Medici in 15th century Florence, whether, you know, the financial powerhouse of Europe, which invented the Renaissance, this great culture, which came first. The two things go together. So my final observation, I think, is that I do regard Melbourne as a creative city. I think it's an amazing place. We've got a bit of everything. We have a wonderful cafe society, a wonderful sense of leisure as well. There's a lot of energy in Melbourne. Design's very important for us. And I think that, you know, the role of the Art Museum is a very important and positive one, and it does have a great future. But I'd be interested to hear your views on all of this. Thank you.
Gerard has indicated he will take questions in a traditional sense, so maybe if I can start on the left and work around, first here, in the green.
I'd like to ask why it is so difficult for directors of art museums and curators to understand the importance of identifying what we are looking at, particularly in terms of paintings, because you get labels on the wall over there. Here is the barrier, actual or electronic. You have blue on grey. You have people leaning over, triggering the noise. You have people trying to look through their bifocals. When we have, in the State Library of Victoria, the Gallery of Historical Paintings, in which the barrier has the information about the painting on it, so it serves the dual purpose of being a barrier and having it right here. I have brought this up with so many state and national art museums. Why is it so hard?
Okay. Well, now there's a challenge. And you've asked a whole series of related questions. The first is that I like the hang, by the way, in the Cowan Gallery in the State Library, but it does have barriers. You're kept behind a fence. And I hope you would accept that the one thing I tried to do through my time at the NGV was to have no barriers, almost no fences. Occasionally, if a work of art, a medieval work, was incredibly fragile, we might just have a very low little step, a platform in front of it. We also remove the glass from a lot of the works because I have a total belief in the goodwill of the public. And I take the view that if you have good security systems generally, if you have a good air filtration system so that you're not getting dirt in the air, you know, that will settle on the surface of the work of art, then you should make it as accessible to the public as possible. There are many works, of course, in the NGV that do have glass, but some of them are actually just left over from when we didn't have a good, you know, air conditioning system and air filtration system, and everything had to be glazed because the air was so filthy. It was one of the reasons for doing the redevelopment. Look, things, I was very pleased that you used the plural, sort of museums and galleries generally, and I'm sure though that the NGV is a major part of your experience. Things have changed, there's no question about that. When the NGV closed in 1999 for the redevelopment, a typical label would have been, you know, Roberts, Tom, born England, died, you know, Australia, 1940, whatever it was. Coming south, 1885, oil on canvas, and the site. That was about it. I think now the NGV has a policy of around about 150 words of explanation about most of the key works in the collection. Not everything, I admit that, but most of the key works now have an explanation. And there are didactic panels in many of the galleries that to give you a bit of background. You know, this is the 17th century Baroque room, and these are some of the fundamentals about, you know, whatever Italian painting might be of the time. It can always be improved, I accept that, and I would have liked more didactic panels. It was a huge debate, interestingly, in the senior management group with the curators. I was all for little mini theses everywhere, and they said, no, Gerard, come on, we've got to. It's a very interesting question. And we took, in 1990, well, when we reopened in 2003, as our model, a set of guidelines that the Getty Museum in Los Angeles developed, and that was that a label of between 150 and 200 words should be written in English that a reasonably educated and literate 16-year-old could understand. Now, and the question was, is that dumbing down? And we tried to get it right. And it's a very, very interesting debate, and the debate continues. I would say this, that I think the great opportunity is shortly to come, and that is that each of us, we don't now have to hire handheld devices to go around exhibitions anymore. Increasingly, you can use your own mobile phone, and increasingly, you'll be able to stand in front of a work of art and simply get information about it on different levels. If you just want a quick explanation, you can get it. If you want part of that download to be cross-references to related works around the world in other museums, or quotes from the artist, or whatever it might be, we're moving in that direction, there's no question. So I'm not trying to be defensive. Everything can be improved enormously. One thing I hope you might have noticed, which I was really pleased about, was when we reopened in the middle of last year, the refurbished Asian galleries. For the very first time, we had bilingual and trilingual labels and didactic panels. So in other words, everything was in Chinese as well. In the Japanese gallery, it was English, Japanese, and Chinese. Hindi and Indonesian were used as appropriate in other parts of the collection. And I would, if I were still there, and I'm sure the new director will be thinking about this and wanting to do it, I think that the NGV, should certainly, as time goes on, extend that into other galleries, so that a Chinese visitor walking into a room of 18th century Italian paintings can get an explanation in Chinese as to what they're looking at. So I think really that these, and of course new technologies, there can be Chinese language, Japanese guides on individual handheld phones. The possibilities are endless. So I hope that that frustration that you felt, one, at least at the NGV, has been slightly mitigated, but I think the future is a very bright one.
Lady in the back of that person.
I wonder if you might make some comments about Australian art. As I understand it, in general, it's not so popular, and apart from retrospectives or themes like women painters, I get the impression that big exhibitions are not so popular. They don't go down as well as, for example, Impressionism.
Well, my response to that is yes and no. Yes, on the numbers, there's no doubt about that, that we have a dedicated building for Australian art, the Ian Potter Centre, NGV Australia, and that has about 750,000 visitors a year, and just over that, about 850,000 go to the building in St Kilda Road. Experience has told us that big Australian exhibitions will not get the numbers and cannot ever get the numbers. It's not just the NGV, it's Sydney, it's Canberra, it's Brisbane. That the incoming imported shows, from around the world bring. That's just a fact of life. I have been deeply disappointed by some of the numbers. I think that the two of the most wonderful shows I've ever seen had low numbers. The John Glover exhibition back in 2004 or 5, an amazing exhibition, had 35,000 visitors. It should have had 100,000 visitors. And even the Von Gerard show, which was one of our 150th anniversary exhibitions, ended up being 50,000 or so, but that should have been 100,000 plus. The great 19th century Australian landscape painter. Having said that, the John Brack show had about 130,000, as did the Australian Impressionism show. But compare that to the Melbourne Winter Masterpieces, when we routinely get 200,000, 250, 300,000. I imagine that the Monet show that's about to happen will have 350,000, say. And the third part of that trilogy that I mentioned on aspects of Impressionism is going to be in NGV Australia, about Australian artists who went to France and knew the Impressionists and reflected Impressionism. And I reckon that'll be 50 or 60,000, and that's a pity. I rather agree with you. There are big issues there about marketing, but perhaps at the end of the day, there is a view that the important things are more to be supported than the local product. If that's the case, that's disappointing. But I don't disagree with you, because I personally, having watched the curatorial team put so much energy and creativity into Australian exhibitions, I've been very surprised by the relatively low numbers. Yeah.
Margaret and
First, I'd like to thank you for the Monk exhibition, which I wasn't going to go to, but a friend who was present encouraged me to, and it's one of the best I've ever seen. most instructive. I didn't think I was very interested in Munch until then.
Oh, thank you. I'll comment on that in a minute, but thank you for saying that.
I was going to ask you about what is now becoming very fashionable, and arts pages in the dailies send you to Copenhagen or wherever through your smartphone for an exhibition and imply that it's the same as going there. Yeah. And to me it's an extension of a good colour reproduction in book, perhaps not as good because of the size problem. And that worries me that this may eventually become preferred to actually going and seeing something.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll answer both of those questions. The first is thank you for what you said about the Munch exhibition. I don't know whether any of you noticed, but when I was wrapping up and bowing out at the NGV in the middle of last year, I was often asked by a journalist, what was your favourite exhibition? Of all these, hundreds of exhibitions, large and small, in your time at the NGV, which one did you enjoy most? And I always said the Munch exhibition. It was a remarkable show, and we had wonderful curators who were very well connected in Scandinavia, for example, and especially in Norway, who put their heart and souls into it. And I say that because at the end of our first year of reopening, we had the Impressionists from the Musée d'Orsay, we had the Caravaggio and Caravaggisti exhibition, we had Munch towards the end of the year. I went off to Europe looking to talk to directors about forthcoming exhibition projects. We always plan 2, 3 and 4 years ahead. And I took the catalogues with me, or sent them on ahead. And they all said, look, we loved reading through the catalogue. What a great year you've had. Wonderful Caravaggio exhibition, fabulous Impressionists from the Musée d'Orsay, but we've seen them all before. How did you pull off the Munch exhibition? Because we've been asking for these Munch works from Norway forever, and the Norwegians won't lend them to us. How did you do it? And one of the answers, part of the answer, was just that argument about distance. That Australians will find it very difficult to go to Oslo, to go to Bergen, to see these works. And there will only be one Munch show probably in anyone's lifetime in Australia. And the Norwegians accepted that argument and said, so we're going to make it a really, really good one. And they sent so many of the greatest works that belong to Norway. Yeah. The variety was extraordinary, and I went in every day. And the other thing that pleased me, excuse me, was that every day the galleries were full of art students, because he's an artist's artist, and the students were drinking it in. Now there's good news for your sort of concern in the second part of your question. Don't worry, it's not going to happen. What we have found, and other museums around the world, around Australia and around the world, have found that as the number of hits on the website go up, more and more people get into your website, they look at the programs you're doing, they download images from your collection, the more visitation to the museum goes up. So one is not taking away from the other. It's actually deepening interest and enriching the kind of experience that you can have. So I think I can say that there is a sound base of statistical evidence to suggest that it won't go the way you're worried about. And that's a good thing. Yeah.
Could we make this second last question and the last question? Heather, please.
Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I'm going to ask you a personal question now, which you don't have to answer. I'm not going to ask you what you think the best museums or galleries are in those you visited, but I'd like to ask if you could suggest perhaps 5 of your favourites, where they are.
Whoa, okay. Let me therefore go for small museums. Because you all know the big museums, the Prado, the Louvre, the Vatican museums, the Uffizi. I won't talk about those museums. I'll talk about the ones that are utterly amazing and that take your breath away. I was asked this by my students. They threw questions back at me. Why do we have museums? What is your... I asked them that. If you have a favourite museum, tell me. And they asked me. And one of them asked an interesting question, not what is your favourite museum, what in your view is the most beautiful museum in the world? And that meant architecture, installation, maybe size, the sense of peace that you might have in an institution. You don't have to have peace in an art museum, by the way. It can be busy and full, and especially a museum of contemporary art. But I didn't have to think about it. I said the Frick Museum in New York. It is exquisitely beautiful. It is one man's vision. They still buy works of art using the Frick endowment, which is about, he had the good sense, unlike many people who create museums open to the public that are privately owned and don't leave them in endowment and hope the state or whatever might take it over. the Frick endowment's worth about 400 million US dollars, so there's always plenty of money to run the place, to maintain it properly, and whenever they've got a bit left over, they buy another great masterpiece to add to the collection. So the Frick, if you want, I suppose, the greatest masterpieces, you know, that you will ever find together in one place, I would say per square metre. The masterpiece ratio per square metre is very, very high in the Frick. Okay, let's now move from North America to France. Well, perhaps the Wallace collection in London is always worth a visit. It's got fantastic things. It's never overcrowded. And Ros Saville, who's a mate of mine, she's just retired as director, had the good sense to get Rick Mather in to cover over the central courtyard, and they've now created the best place in the whole of London for lunch and afternoon tea. So just go there. It's fantastic. And then you can sort of wander off and look at... And the Paris equivalent, of course, of the Frick and the Wallace is smaller than both. It's the Musée Nissim Caimondo, up in the 17th. Not much visited, a bit forgotten, but it's right beside the Parc Monceau, so you can... which was the Orléans family's, you know, the garden of their great pre-revolutionary Paris residence. And you still see the remnants of the great 18th century garden, literally next door. It's a house of the 1870s. Just up the road, in fact, from the house described in The Hair with Amber Eyes by Edmond de Waal, where the Ephrussis lived. And it was another Jewish family, a bit like the Rothschilds, that they had tremendous taste. They loved the 18th century, and this, the Nissim Caimondo family just bought unbelievably wonderful things and gifted them to the state. Tragically, and it's a very sad story, when you go there, not unlike the Ephrussi family written about in The Hair with Amber Eyes, most of the family perished, of course, in the Holocaust. It was a great tragedy, but they'd already given the house and the collection to the French state. Well, while I'm on to the Rothschilds, I might as well also say in London, perhaps, or out of London, Waterston Manor. But now I'm being very 18th century, because these tastes I'm talking about, above all, I think the people who created these museums loved the 18th century. Let's go to something more modern. I think the de Menil collection in Houston, for example, in Texas, is a very modern gallery of largely of post-war art. Very edgy, beautifully designed, very, very simple. I would certainly recommend that. Well, how many is that 5? but also, the daughter of the de Menils of Texas, she and her husband created a centre called the DIA Centre, D-I-A, which is north of New York. And it's about an hour and a half out of New York. There are buses up there and trains, all for very edgy contemporary art. Go and see that too.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I was very struck, having recently suffered in the Louvre. What are some of the options to enable the French to reclaim it for themselves?
Right. There are very few, and this is why there is such despair in France. You might remember a number of years ago, at least 15 years ago in fact, the Prado decided to do what David Walsh has done with his private museum in Hobart, because it's costing him a great deal of money. It started off being free. He's realised that the annual running costs are higher than he thought they would be, and so he now charges, and that's fine. I mean, I have no complaint. It's a private institution. He's done an amazing thing. He's put a couple of $100 million of his own money into a public facility, so that is a fantastic thing, no problem at all. But he's now said that to make ends meet, he's going to have to charge, unless you're a Tasmanian. Now, I grew up in Tasmania. I don't have a Tasmanian passport, I'm afraid, so, but I don't think I dare say I'm a Tasmanian, so therefore I won't pay the entrance charge. But the Prado tried to bring in a regulation, and the Russians do it, of course. There are two queues at the Hermitage, the Russian queue and the foreign tourist queue, and the foreign tourists pay 10 times what the Russians pay, and that's fair enough, that's good, because you know there is such poverty and incomes are so low in Russia. There's no problem with that either in my own mind. But the Prado was forced to stop by the European Union, and they were told that the only distinction you can have is European Union member and non-European Union. You can't have Spaniard and non-Spaniard. And that wrecked the whole thing, so they had to give it up. The French have very few options for those kinds of reasons. And remember, incoming cultural tourism is very important to the French economy. But the cost to the French is losing their cultural patrimony. They cannot have the kind of access to it that you have if you want to wander down to Federation Square and go and see the great masterpieces of Australian art, for example. The galleries will hopefully have plenty of people in them, but they won't be crowded. And that's the great problem. I don't know what the answer is, other than, as I think I said to you, I now do all my museum visiting in Paris. I just buy that book, What's On in Paris. There's an English language version for the next week, and you just work out all the opening hours, and you go to every museum at night. And that's the only time, the only way you can get a bit of peace and respite. And if you work it out, the Pompidou's open every night until very late. The Louvre's open twice a week late, and the d'Orsay is open twice a week late. And just work out all the opening times, and that's when you go. Between 7 and 9, something like that. Yeah.
Well, I think we'll have to draw the questions to a conclusion here. I'm sure we could have kept going for 3 o'clock, because I think you've got the record now. But it's no wonder, because it's been a fascinating session. I'd like to call upon Councillor Leo Santalcia to thank you. But to introduce Leo, Leo's been in the council, I think, about 3 years. He's a professional accountant and business consultant. He's brought great strengths in those areas which were much needed by the council, and so I'm personally very happy to work with Leo and benefit from his guidance with those talents. And in particular, in recent times, Leo's also been contributing greatly to our governance challenges that the council is facing with this institution, where we're trying to bring the organisation into the 21st century. And of course, he's been working very closely with Dr. Meredith Doig in the Red here. Meredith is a company director of a number of significant companies, or has been, a past council of the University of Melbourne, on the council, and currently a council on another university. So Meredith has also been contributing very significantly to our governance restructures. So I thank them both for their great contributions. So with that, Leo,
thanks very much, David. I'd just like to take this opportunity on behalf of the members of the Graduate Union to thank you, Gerard, for your interesting and informative presentation on the history and the future of the Art Museum. Some of the themes that I took out of Gerard's presentation are equally relevant to our organisation or our association, particularly finding the balance between volume, that is the number of members, and the quality of the experience that our membership has in using the facilities, whether it's as a learning opportunity, as a leisure opportunity, or even an enjoyment opportunity. Those 3 themes that Gerard mentioned. The need to initiate new buildings and new facilities. Now, we've done that over the last several years. We're standing in one of the rooms now, also the Stella Langford wing. But on the other side, the building of new activities or new enhancements to our membership and making the membership more relevant to our existing members as well as prospective members. The other theme that Doctor talked about was the need for funding, and that mix between either private or public. In our case, it's again generated from within, but we've got to be very mindful of our commitments to our loans and the strategies that we could possibly learn about fundraising or bequests to help us over the ensuing years to meet our capital requirements. So on that, thank you again for the presentation, particularly on the history and the future of the Art Museum, and as a small gesture of our appreciation, accept this.
Thank you very much.